I swear to you everything I'm about to tell really happened to me. And even now, at 74 years old, I can still feel the sting in my chest as if it happened yesterday. It started the day I walked into my sister's dining room and saw my late brother's antique pocket watch. My father's passed down through generations, sitting in front of my smug nephew Michael, as if it already belonged to him. His smirk, his words, and the laughter that followed humiliated me in front of the entire family. That pocket watch wasn't just a trinket. It was the very symbol of my father's life. And that night my nephew announced to everyone that he was going to rewrite our family history without me in it. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is. Right now, it's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. I should have seen it coming years earlier. But like most betrayals, it crept up on me under the mask of smiles and Sunday dinners. Michael was always my sister's golden child, the one who could do no wrong. He was 29, full of slick words and dressed in tailored suits that screamed future senator. Though he was just a real estate broker with a talent for spinning lies. At 74, I wasn't the loudest voice in the room anymore, and Michael knew it. It was after my brother's funeral that the true war began. We were in St. Louis, Missouri, where our family had lived for generations. The service had just ended at the old cathedral basilica, and people were still trickling out when Michael approached me with a look that could sour milk. He leaned close enough so that no one else would hear, and whispered, "You're finished, old man. Nobody remembers you, and I'll make sure they never do." I froze. The words cut deeper than I expected. I had built a life, a reputation, and still carried my father's lessons like scripture. And yet, here was this entitled nephew telling me I was nothing. What I didn't know then was how far he was willing to go to erase me. That night after the funeral, I couldn't sleep. The air in my small apartment near Forest Park felt heavy, almost suffocating, and every creak of the floorboards seemed like a reminder that my life was shrinking down to nothing. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at that empty glass of bourbon, my father's words echoing in my head. "Respect is built by deeds, son, not by the noise you make in a room." Michael didn't understand that he didn't want to build anything. He wanted to seize it, rewrite it, stamp his name on it, like it had been his all along. And worse, he had the charisma to pull people along with him. By the following weekend, whispers had already started. My cousin Clara, who'd always been fond of me, pulled me aside at my sister's house and asked, "Did you really tell Michael he was the rightful heir to Grandpa's estate?" I blinked at her. "What? Of course not." She frowned. "That's strange," Michael said. "You admitted it in front of everyone at the funeral reception, that you'd rather see the legacy in his hands than fade out." Quietly, my blood ran cold. That slick bastard had planted lies right under my nose. He was trying to make it look like I'd given him my blessing to erase myself. I didn't confront him right away. No, I watched, because something told me this wasn't just about stories around the dinner table or family heirlooms. This was about moneyland influence, the kind of inheritance people quietly claw at when the oldest generation starts dying off. My suspicions were confirmed when I received a letter from the county courthouse. A legal notice. My heart stopped as I read it. Michael had filed paperwork claiming I had relinquished my rights to my father's estate, including the farmhouse outside Columbia, that had been in our family since 1902. He was arguing I was too old to manage it, that I had verbally agreed it should be passed to him. It wasn't just a lie, It was a declaration of war. For weeks, I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I walked the streets of downtown St. Louis like a ghost, wondering how a man of 74 could fight someone with the energy, charm, and resources of a 30-year-old shark. At coffee shops, I overheard neighbors talking about Michael's plans for revitalizing the farmhouse, turning it into some trendy Airbnb property. He was spinning stories before the ink had even dried on his fraudulent paperwork. And yet, when I confronted my sister about it, she refused to believe me. He wouldn't do that without reason, she said, clutching her pearls as if they might strangle her. Maybe you misunderstood. Misunderstood. My own sister was already leaning toward him, already ready to discard me like an inconvenient memory. That was the first time I realized something chilling. Michael wasn't just trying to take property. He was trying to erase me. If he controlled the estate, if he rewrote the stories, if he charmed everyone into thinking I'd stepped aside willingly, then in the eyes of history, I was already gone. But I wasn't about to let that smug boy write me out. One night, sitting alone at the Broadway Oyster Bar, I made my decision. The jukebox was playing an old blues tune, and the smell of fried catfish hung in the air. I took out a napkin and wrote 3 words. Fight, don't fade. I folded it, slid it into my pocket, and ordered another bourbon. My hands shook, but my resolve hardened. Michael thought I was too old, too weak, too irrelevant to fight back. He thought wrong. What he didn't know was that I had spent my career, decades of my life, working as a legal clerk in Jefferson City. I knew the courts, the filings, the way evidence worked. I wasn't rich, I wasn't powerful, but I understood the law better than he ever would. And if it was war he wanted, then war he would get. But before I struck back, I needed to know just how deep his betrayal went. That meant digging. That meant risking humiliation and maybe even more betrayal. And it meant looking into places I had long avoided, like old family archives, bank records, and the secrets my brother left behind before he died. Because I had a sickening feeling this wasn't just about a farmhouse. It was about everything. The night I drove to Columbia to look at the farmhouse, the September air was thick with the smell of wet hay. The house had been empty for months since my brother passed, and when I pulled up the gravel drive, my headlights caught a black SUV parked at the side. I cut the engine and sat there in the dark, my pulse thundering in my ears. And then I saw him, Michael, walking out of the house with a stranger in a suit carrying rolled-up blueprints. He was already planning renovations, already acting like the place was his. I ducked low in my seat, heart hammering. They stopped at the SUV, laughing, pointing at the land, like they were kings dividing a kingdom. And when the stranger shook Michael's hand, I realized just how far my nephew's arrogance had gone. He wasn't just erasing me, he was selling my father's blood, sweat, and legacy to strangers. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. That was the moment I swore to myself Michael was not going to win. Not over me, not over history, but I also knew this was only the beginning. The drive back from Columbia to St. Louis felt longer than usual. My headlights cutting through the dark Missouri countryside, while my mind raced faster than the car itself. I could still see Michael's smug silhouette in front of that farmhouse, shaking hands, like a monarch doling out scraps of power. It wasn't just arrogance. It was ownership. He already believed he had won. By the time I reached my apartment near Forest Park, it was past 2 in the morning. I didn't bother turning on the lights. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant horns of freight trains. My hand was clenched around my father's old fountain pen, the one relic I still had that Michael hadn't touched. I pulled out a pad of yellow legal paper and started writing. Not a diary, but a record. Every word Michael had said to me, every lie he had spread, every suspicious meeting I had seen, I wrote until the sun began to creep through the blinds. Because if he wanted to erase me, I would make sure there was a written trail proving exactly what he had done. But I needed more than notes. I needed proof. The first place I went was the courthouse. St. Louis County. Courthouse is a gray slab of stone and glass, downtown near Market Street. Walking through those heavy glass doors, I felt the years on my shoulders. Their younger clerks glanced at me like I was just another doddering old man trying to make sense of paperwork. What they didn't realize was that I had spent 40 years working in courthouses across Missouri. I knew the smell of bureaucracy. Like the back of my hand, I requested copies of the filings Michael had submitted. And when I opened the envelope in the lobby, my blood boiled. He had forged my signature. Not a perfect forgery. No, it was too clean. Too sharp, but close enough that a judge who didn't know me might believe it. It stated that I hereby relinquished all claims to the Whitmore estate, including properties, heirlooms, and assets dated just 2 days after my brother's funeral. My name, my dignity, my bloodline are reduced to ink Michael had stolen. For a moment, rage nearly consumed me. I wanted to march to his office, slam the paper in his face, and beat that smug grin off his skull. But I forced myself to breathe. This was what he wanted, for me to explode, to look unstable, to make his lies more believable. No, if I was going to take him down, I needed to be patient. I needed to be clever. And above all, I needed allies. The first ally came in the form of an unexpected phone call. Her name was Linda, my late brother's secretary. She worked with him at his insurance firm in Columbia for over 20 years, and she still remembered me from holiday parties. Her voice trembled when she said, "I don't know who else to call, but something isn't right with Michael." I leaned back in my chair, clutching the receiver. "Tell me," she explained, that after my brother's death, Michael had shown up at the office demanding files, old tax returns, property deeds, and insurance records. He claimed I'd authorized him to collect them, but Linda said his story didn't add up. "I've known you long enough, sir," she said. "You would never hand things over without signing them in front of me." She was right, and the fact that Michael had been digging through documents I hadn't even seen, yet made my stomach twist. I drove down to Columbia again, this time during the day. Linda met me at the firm, a tidy little brick building on Broadway. She handed me a box of files she'd quietly saved, whispering, "I think he's hiding something big." Inside were decades of financial records. I combed through them that night in a cheap motel under the yellow glow of a flickering lamp. Buried deep in the pile, I found it, a set of unexplained withdrawals from my father's account back in the 1990s, when Michael was barely a teenager. Tens of thousands of dollars siphoned out under the guise of educational expenses. But I remembered those years. Michael never went to private school. He barely scraped through public high school. So where had the money gone? The paper trail grew darker the deeper I dug. Shell companies, land transfers, and one name that kept popping up on documents, Whitmore Development LLC. I nearly dropped the file when I realized what it was. Michael had created a company in our family's name long before my brother's death. He had been positioning himself for years, maybe decades, to swallow the estate whole. It wasn't just betrayal, it was premeditated theft. The more I uncovered, the more dangerous it felt. One night after leaving the courthouse, I noticed headlights in my rear-view mirror that didn't fade no matter how many turns I took. A black SUV. My pulse quickened. I cut down side streets, finally pulling into the lot of a 24-hour diner in Clayton. I sat there pretending to read a menu while peeking through the blinds. The SUV idled across the street for nearly 20 minutes before finally pulling away. Michael was watching me. He knew I was digging, and he wasn't going to let me do it. Quietly, I pressed my palms against the table, sweat dripping down my neck. If he thought intimidation would scare me, he was wrong. All it did was fuel the fire, but I also realized I was alone in this fight, and one wrong step could end with me silenced. So I made a plan. I reached out to an old friend from my courthouse days, a retired judge named Harold. He was gruff, white-haired, and carried the kind of reputation you couldn't buy. When I showed him Michael's forged documents and the shell companies, he leaned back in his recliner, eyes narrowing. "This isn't just fraud," he said. "This is conspiracy. If you push this into court, you can take him down, but you'll need more than paper. You'll need witnesses." And that was the hardest part, because witnesses meant dragging family into the light, forcing them to choose between me and Michael. And I knew most of them had already been charmed by his easy smile and empty promises. Still, Harold was right. I couldn't win this war on paper alone. I had to break Michael's spell, and that meant setting a trap. I decided to bait him. I called my sister, pretending to surrender. I told her I was tired, that I didn't want to fight anymore, that maybe Michael was right, that maybe it was time to let go of the estate. Her voice softened, almost relieved. "That's wise, brother. It's time to pass the torch." But what she didn't know was that I had Harold recording the call from his end, proof that Michael and his allies believed I had relinquished the estate, not because I had signed anything willingly, but because they had pressured me into it. And then I went further. I scheduled a meeting with Michael at the farmhouse. He arrived in that same black SUV, wearing a tailored blue suit, and a smirk that made me want to put him through the wall. "So you've come to your senses," he said, shaking my hand with false warmth. About time I kept my voice steady. "If I step aside, I want something in writing." "Something fair," he laughed. "Fair, uncle. You're lucky. I'm even letting you keep your name in the story." What he didn't realize was that every word was being recorded. It hidden a small recorder in my pocket, capturing every arrogant syllable. But the real bombshell came when he bragged, too confident for his own good. He admitted that he had already secured investors, already shifted funds, already planned to liquidate half the farmland into luxury condos. My father's land gone. That was when I knew the gloves were off. I walked away from that meeting with fire in my veins and a recording that could destroy him. But I also knew Michael wasn't going to let me go unchallenged. And the next move he made would be one that nearly cost me everything. Michael's counterattack came faster than I expected. 2 weeks after that recorded meeting at the farmhouse, I woke up to a pounding at my door. It was 7 in the morning, and I shuffled in my robe to the entrance of my St. Louis apartment. When I opened it, 2 uniformed police officers stood there. Mr. Whitmore, one asked, "Yes?" I croaked suddenly, wide awake. "You're under investigation for elder neglect and financial misconduct." My knees nearly gave out. What? That's insane. But they were already handing me paperwork complaints filed by my own nephew. According to Michael, I had mismanaged family funds, neglected property upkeep, and even endangered my late brother's health by failing to assist with his care before his death. Lies, every last one of them. But on paper they looked damning. I stood frozen in the doorway, clutching the papers with trembling hands as the officers left. And in that moment, I understood the depth of Michael's cruelty. He wasn't just trying to erase me from history. He was trying to bury me alive under accusations so vile that no one would care whether I disappeared. For 3 days, I barely ate. The shame of the accusation spread fast. Neighbors whispered in the lobby, church. Acquaintances avoided my gaze. My sister stopped answering my calls. Even my cousin Clara sent me a cold text. Maybe it's best if you just let Michael handle things now. You're too old for this fight. The walls were closing in. But then Harold came by. The old judge walked straight into my apartment without knocking, slammed the papers on the table and growled, "This is slander, and he'll be damned if I watch that boy ruin you." I felt tears sting my eyes. What if nobody believes me? Harold leaned close, his grey eyes fierce. Then, well, make them believe you have the recordings, you have the forged documents. And now, thanks to his arrogance, you have motive. This isn't the end. John, it's the beginning. For the first time in weeks, I felt hope. We filed a countersuit within days. Fraud, forgery, conspiracy. Harold used his old connections to make sure the case didn't get buried under Michael's influence. It was like lighting a match in a room full of gasoline. Suddenly, Michael wasn't the untouchable golden boy anymore. He was a defendant. But court battles move slowly, and Michael wasn't about to sit idle. He doubled down in public billboards in Columbia, went up advertising, Whitmore Development, preserving our family legacy. His face was plastered across local newspapers, smiling like some sainted heir ready to bless the city with his vision. At family gatherings, I became the villain in whispered conversations. "Hare's senile," one aunt muttered. "He's just bitter," another said. The isolation was suffocating, but I pressed forward, clinging to the evidence I had gathered. And then came the hearing. It was a cold January morning when I walked into the St. Louis County Courthouse, clutching my leather briefcase. Michael was already there, strutting through the lobby in a navy blue overcoat, surrounded by a small entourage of investors and lawyers. He caught my eye and smirked, mouthing the words, "You're finished." The hearing itself was grueling. Michael's attorneys painted me as a bitter old man clinging to relevance, waving papers and affidavits. They claimed proved my incompetence, but when Harold introduced the recording from our farmhouse meeting, the one where Michael boasted about liquidating the farmland, the room went silent. The judge's eyes narrowed. Michael's confident smirk faltered for the first time, but the fight was far from over. The judge allowed the case to move forward to trial, which meant discovery, which meant digging even deeper into Michael's finances, which meant exposing every rotten shell company and forged document he had used to prop up his empire. For me, it was a lifeline. For Michael, it was a threat he couldn't ignore. The threats began subtly. First, anonymous letters slipped under my door, dropped the case, or else, then phone calls at midnight. Heavy, breathing, silence. And one night after leaving Harold's house, I found the tires of my car slash the words, "Old Rat," spray-painted across the hood. I stood in the cold night air staring at the dripping paint, and something inside me shifted. Fear turned into fury. Michael wanted me scared, small, erased. Instead, he'd awakened something I hadn't felt in decades, the fire of a man who refused to be silenced. So I escalated. I hired a private investigator named Denise, a sharp-eyed woman with a leather jacket and a voice like gravel. Within 2 weeks, she uncovered bank statements that tied Michael's Whitmore Development LLC to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Money laundering, tax evasion. The kind of crimes that didn't just ruin reputations. They put men in prison. When I saw the documents spread across my dining table, I felt a surge of vindication so strong it nearly buckled. My knees. Michael thought he was clever, but he had left a trail. And now I had it. The next court session, we dropped the evidence like a bomb. Michael's lawyers scrambled the judge's face, darkened, and whispers rippled through the courtroom. For the first time, the balance of power shifted. Michael's smirk vanished completely. But I knew better than to celebrate. Early cornered animals were the most dangerous, and Michael wasn't done fighting. Sure enough, 2 nights later, someone broke into my apartment. I had been asleep on the couch when the sound of splintering wood jolted me awake. My heart pounded as I grabbed the old baseball bat I kept by the door. The intruder's footsteps creaked across the floor. Michael I whispered into the dark, though I already knew he wouldn't dirty his hands himself. A shadow lunged at me, and instinct took over. I swung the bat with everything I had. The crack echoed like a gunshot, and the intruder stumbled back, cursing before bolting out the door. I stood there in the wreckage of my apartment, shaking bat in hand, adrenaline burning through my veins. They hadn't stolen anything. They hadn't needed to. This was a warning. But instead of scaring me off, it cemented my resolve. Michael had escalated to violence, which meant he was desperate, which meant he was close to losing, and that realization gave me strength. The trial was set for March. For weeks leading up to it, I prepared like a soldier before battle. Every document, every recording, every witness was lined up. Harold drilled me on testimony until my voice cracked. Denise dug deeper, unearthing more of Michael's dirty dealings. On this morning of trial, I stood outside the courthouse in my best suit, the old fountain pen tucked into my pocket like a talisman. My reflection in the glass door showed a man weathered by age but unbroken. And as I stepped inside, I thought of my father's words. Respect is built by deeds, not by noise. Michael had built his empire on noise, lies, fraud. I was about to bring it crashing down. The trial opened in a hushed courtroom, thick with tension. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Harold, who, though retired, had agreed to represent me as counsel with special permission. Michael strutted in like he owned the place. His hair slicked back his navy suit, glimmering under the fluorescent lights. He winked at the crowd, a sea of reporters, investors, and family who had come to watch what felt less like a trial and more like a gladiator match. The judge, a stern woman named Margaret Holloway, called us to order. She had no patience for theatrics, which meant Michael's smug charm wouldn't get him far. Still, he leaned back in his chair like a man certain of victory. Set the prosecution opened with a clean narrative. I was an aging, bitter uncle trying to block a brilliant young heir from revitalizing the Whitmore legacy. Michael's lawyers painted me as unstable, unfit, and jealous. They played heavily on my age, suggesting I was confused, forgetful, and unwilling to face the future. And for a moment I worried. The jury leaned forward, nodding at the smooth words Michael's counsel delivered. Doubt crept in like a chill draft, but then Harold stood. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't need to. He laid out a simple, brutal truth, forged signatures, secret shell companies, offshore accounts, threats, and lies. He held up the documents Denise had uncovered, laid out the forged will, and finally, like a hammer on stone, played the recording of Michael, bragging about liquidating the farmland. The courtroom froze. Michael's face, once smug, twisted into panic. He shot up in his seat, stammering that recording is fake, it's manipulated, but the jury's eyes had already hardened. They could hear the arrogance, the greed dripping from his every word. When the session adjourned for the day, reporters swarmed the steps of the courthouse. Headlines the next morning read, Whitmore, heir, accused of fraud and forgery. For the first time, Michael wasn't the golden boy, he was a scandal. But the war wasn't over. Michael's team countered viciously. They dragged my personal life into the spotlight, painting me as a lonely old man who had squandered his career, who clung to memories instead of accomplishments. They called family members to testify against Mimi's own sister. Among them, I'll never forget the moment she took the stand, dressed in her Sunday best, her eyes cold as steel. She told the jury I had always resented Michael, that I had once told her I wished he'd never been born. The words cut deeper than any knife. I wanted to shout, to scream that it was a lie, but Harold squeezed my arm. Grounding me, let it pass, he whispered. The truth is stronger. And he was right, because when Linda, my brother's old secretary, testified next, she dismantled Michael's story piece by piece. She recounted how he had bullied her for documents, how his claims didn't match reality, how she had saved files because she knew something was wrong. By the end of her testimony, the jury was leaning forward again, not toward Michael, but toward me. Still, Michael wasn't done. On the third day of trial, he tried a final gambit. His attorneys introduced a newly discovered letter, supposedly written by me years ago, stating that I had no interest in the estate. It was a clumsy forgery, but dangerous enough to sway uncertain minds. I felt my chest tighten. Was this how it ended? Would I be erased by one more lie? Then Harold stood again, holding the letter with a faint smile. Your Honor, he said, the date on this letter is 1998, yet the paper stock it's written on was manufactured until 2002. The courtroom erupted. Michael's face drained of color. Judge Holloway slammed her gavel. Enough, I've seen more than enough. The verdict came swiftly. The jury found Michael guilty of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to defraud the estate, his company. Whitmore Development LLC was dissolved. His assets were frozen, and he faced federal investigation for tax evasion and money laundering. As the judge read the decision, I stared across the courtroom at my nephew. His once perfect posture sagged, his smirk long gone. For the first time, he looked small. When the bailiff moved to escort him out, Michael glared at me with venom in his eyes. You should have stayed forgotten. Old man, he hissed. I leaned forward, meeting his gaze with all the fire left in me. History remembers the truth, and the truth is, you lost. The fallout was swift and brutal. Reporters tore into Michael's past, unearthing every dirty deal he had ever made. Investors fled like rats from a sinking ship. My sister stopped returning his calls, ashamed of the lies she had parroted in his defense. Within weeks, Michael's name was synonymous with disgrace across Missouri. As for me, I wasn't celebrated, not exactly. At 74, I didn't crave parades or applause, but neighbors who once avoided me now nodded with respect. Cousins who whispered behind my back now apologized. And for the first time in decades, I felt like my father's legacy was safe. The farmhouse in Columbia was restored, not as an Airbnb or a development project, but as a family retreat, just as it had always been. I visited on quiet weekends, sitting on the porch with a glass of bourbon, listening to the cicadas hum in the fields. Sometimes I thought about Michael, about the boy he once was, and the man he chose to become. And though he had tried to erase me in the end, he had erased himself. One evening months after the trial, I found myself alone at the farmhouse, watching the sun dip behind the cornfields. The air was still heavy with the smell of earth and memory. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my father's fountain pen, turning it between my fingers. This is where it ends. I whispered to the fields, to the ghosts of my father, and brother, to anyone listening. Because, though I had won, though Michael had been ruined, the scars would never fade. Betrayal from blood is the deepest kind. And as the last light disappeared, I realized something chilling. Michael had failed to erase me, but in fighting him, in tearing him down, I had become the very thing he feared, most unforgettable. The end.